Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is William Jenkins, and I'm the director of the City Institute here at York University in Toronto, Canada. And our institute was established in 2006 as an organized research unit at the university. And we are a community of affiliated professors, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, undergraduates, and visiting scholars. And we all share an interest in interdisciplinary, collaborative approaches to critical urban research. Of course, we have to deal with COVID-19 at the moment, but we're carrying on with our research as best we can, operating in a virtual capacity, just like the rest of the university. And our researchers are engaged in several funded projects, examining issues such as urbanization and gender in the global south, also issues of suburbanization and housing in Canada, other parts of the world. These sorts of issues around housing are also part of our research agenda. The phenomenon of the smart city as well, and of course research on several themes affecting the Toronto region. And although we may not all be gathered in the same place in the Toronto region on this occasion, I'd like to acknowledge that many Indigenous nations in this part of Canada have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, and that this territory is subject to the dish with one spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to care and share for the Great Lakes region. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's workshop on edited collections and urban studies, which we hope will be of a special use to those of you who are dreaming, who are planning, or who are actively in the process of putting together an edited collection of some sort, whether in the form of a book or in the form of a special issue of a journal. And this is the first of 3 events that we have scheduled between now and the end of June. Just to say a few words on the upcoming 2 events. On the 10th of June at 3 o'clock Eastern time, Thursday, we will be launching Jacqueline MacLeod Rogers's book entitled McLuhan's Technosensorium City, Coming to Our Senses in a Programmed Environment. So if you are intrigued by the idea of Marshall McLuhan as an urbanist, please join us then. Also on Wednesday, the 23rd of June at 7 p.m, we'll be presenting a webinar in collaboration with Black Urbanism Toronto entitled Envisioning Toronto's Little Jamaica Culture District, Prospects and Challenges. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Little Jamaica in Eglinton West in Midtown Toronto has emerged over the decades as an important center of Black Canadian economic, cultural, and social expression. And yet the impact of 10 years of light rail construction, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic and gentrification processes, have generated resistance and questions about cultural protection, community preservation, these sorts of things. So we have assembled a panel of speakers to discuss these issues, some of whom are Toronto-based, some of whom have experiences from other places. So as we get our posters together for these later events, please keep an eye out for our emails, and please do circulate to those who may be interested, and we hope that you can attend as well. And so to today, and when I was considering this idea for a workshop, I looked around to my colleagues in the Institute to see who had recently come out of an editing or a co-editing project, to see if they could share a few stories with us. And I'm delighted that this panel of 3 has emerged, featuring Laam, Rosa, Tchoukaleyska, and Begyong. Just to introduce our three panelists, Laam is an associate professor in the Department of Politics here at York. Her research and teaching focuses on radical urban politics in North America and South Korea, and she has recently co-edited On the Margins of Urban South Korea, Core Location as Method and Praxis with the University of Toronto Press in 2019. Rosa Tchoukaleyska, formerly a postdoctoral fellow at the City Institute, is now an assistant professor in the School of Science and the Environment at Memorial University in Newfoundland. She has published extensively about public space issues in France and Canada, and has co-edited 3 special issue journals to date in Society and Space, the Canadian Journal of Urban Research, and the Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship. Last but not least, Douglas Young is an associate professor in the Department of Social Science at York University. He has worked on the legacies of socialist and modernist urbanism in Berlin, Hanoi, and Stockholm, as well as suburban decline and renewal here in Toronto. He has most recently co-edited Socialist and Post-Socialist Urbanisms, Critical Reflections from a Global Perspective with the University of Toronto Press in 2020. And so I've invited each panelist to say a few words about their experiences as co-editors, the contexts behind the emergence of their respective collections, the sorts of challenges they faced, working with publishers' style guides, any language-related issues, for example, the merits of going for a book collection versus a journal special issue, and any other advice, basically, that would be especially useful to early career researchers and anyone who's considering undertaking this sort of academic challenge. And I'm sure some of you out there will be thinking of additional issues as we go along, and so the speakers will be entertaining questions from you and perhaps also from each other in the second half of today's session. So without any more delays, I will now hand it over to Professor Doug Young.
Thanks, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is well and surviving the pandemic. My comments today are based on the book, which I co-edited with my friend and colleague, Lisa Drummond, who very sadly passed away in January of this year. Over the course of the 20 years that I knew Lisa, we did many things together. We taught together, we researched and published, we traveled to many parts of the world, and we coordinated the Urban Studies program at York University. I'm thrilled that the book was published before Lisa died, and I think of the book as being very much part of her legacy. So my comments today I've organized into 5 parts. I'm going to say a few words about where the idea for the book originated and what is in the book. I'm going to say a few things about working with the press, a few things about working with contributing authors, a few things about working with the co-editor, and then I'll make some concluding remarks. So the idea for the book originates in a SSHRC standard research grant that was awarded to Lisa and me 11 years ago in the spring of 2010. And that was for a project called Socialist Cities in the 21st Century, Modernist Legacies and Contemporary Urban Policymaking. In this project, we explored spaces in 3 cities, Hanoi, Berlin, and Stockholm. And the spaces we chose had been shaped in the 1950s and 60s intentionally to represent the socialism of that particular place and that particular, they've been chosen to represent a particular socialism in a particular geographic location of the world. So what we were interested in was looking at them in the 21st century to understand what their legacy was. How do people live with those spaces in the present day? So we presented our research at many conferences in Canada and internationally. And those conference presentations culminated in the annual meeting of the Association of American Geographers in Los Angeles in 2013, where we had put out a call for papers. We received sufficient responses that we organized 2 panel sessions of papers, and they were amazing. So I said to Lisa, we need to do something with this. And she said, we should do a book. So I have to thank Lisa for being the person who said we should turn this, what started with our SSHRC research grant, we should turn that into a book. And several years later, in March of 2020, the book was published by University of Toronto Press. So it's a book of about 320 pages. There's an introduction and a conclusion, which Lisa and I co-authored. And she and I each co-authored a chapter with one of our postdoctoral research fellows. She wrote with Bing Nguyen, and I wrote with Marcus Kipp, who at the time was a PhD student at York University in sociology. So in total, not counting the introduction and conclusion, there were 14 chapters, some of which are co-authored. And in addition to Lisa and me, there are 17 contributing authors to the book. So when you pitch a book idea to a press, you need to tell them how this is distinct from other books that have been published in that general field. So what we were able to say is that most books that had been published on socialist and post-socialist cities looked either at Central and Eastern European cities or Asian cities. Our book, we argued, would have a global reach. And in the end, we have chapters on cities in Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Africa, and Central America. So we had argued, and I think we delivered, that a book with a global reach would be a new contribution to knowledge in that field. The publisher we worked with was the University of Toronto Press, whom we approached with our idea. We liked the fact that they were local, which meant, then that we could actually meet face-to-face with them in their offices. We liked the fact that they would sell the book at what is a relatively reasonable price of, I think, $39.95, which means that it is possible to imagine a student or a member of the general public would consider buying the book. At a conference, some years before that, we had been approached by a publisher, I think Palgrave, who had asked if we would be interested in doing a book with them, but we declined because they only publish in hardback and the books sell for about $150, guaranteeing that the only purchasers would be libraries. So we were fortunate in that we had excellent relationships with the acquisitions editors that we worked with. We started with one, and we switched to another. Oh, I should also add that I had worked previously with University of Toronto Press on a book co-authored with Roger Kyle and Julien Boudreau that was published in 2009. So I had a history of a good working relationship with that press. I'll make a couple of points about the contract with the publisher. So if more than 50% of the authors in an edited volume are Canadian, the federal government will provide a publishing subvention. In our case, fewer than 50% were Canadian, so that subvention from the government was not going to be a possibility. So the press asked us to find some funds, to search funds that we could access to provide some financial support for the publication of the book. So we agreed in the contract to a certain amount, and we agreed that we would try for an additional amount. And what we found was that through our faculty, liberal arts and professional studies, we accessed two funds that each gave a small amount, but given the very tight margins of the publisher, that was quite helpful. One thing we hadn't noticed in our contract is that we were responsible for the index to the book. And we only realized that near the very end of the process, and that came as quite a surprise for us. I mean, ultimately, we did it, but it was a bit of a shock. Another point is with respect to cover design, we had asked to have veto over the design. They would not agree to that, but in the contract, they agreed to consult with us, and ultimately, we kind of co-designed the cover with their designer, and we're very happy with it. I think all the other terms of the contract, they're pretty standard for contracts between editors and a publisher on a scholarly publication in terms of royalties, rights, numbers of copies that the editors will receive, the free copies that you will receive. The most challenging part of doing this book, I have to say, was working with the contributing authors. And we worked with, as I said, 17. So that is a lot of people to be the work of whom you're trying to coordinate, people located in different places around the world, some of whom we already knew well, others of whom we didn't know at all. Some of them were senior scholars, some were PhD students, some spoke English as their first language, others didn't. Some wrote beautifully, others not so beautifully. Some met deadlines, others did not meet deadlines. And the last 2 points were the most serious. The fact that the writing was very uneven, the quality of the writing, the clarity of the writing, and meeting deadlines. Those were the two big problems. So with respect to the writing, Lisa and I eventually hired at our own expense a copy editor to go through each chapter to not mute the individual voice of each contributing author, but to kind of bring them into line in a way that brought the less beautifully written chapters up in terms of their quality. And I was trying to think exactly when we hired a copy editor. I think it was in time for the second submission of the manuscript. So as you probably know, you submit a complete manuscript. It goes out for review by 3 anonymous reviewers. They give comments. You then respond to the comments and resubmit. So I think it was between the first and the second round of submissions. In terms of the authors who were very bad at meeting deadlines, this was a very difficult thing to deal with because we toyed with dropping 1 or 2 chapters. But then at that point, we thought that would leave such a hole in the collection, and it was too late to find replacement authors to start the process all over again with them. So we decided to wait, and that probably cost at least 6 months, maybe up to 12 months over the whole life of bringing this book to press. And I'll just say another significant delay in the whole process was the review process, right? So the book went out to 3 reviewers. They're asked to give their feedback, I think within a month or 2 months. So we got a review from reviewer A that was really outstanding. Reviewer B, it was quite good. Reviewer C, it seemed, didn't like the book much at all. So then we had to respond. We had to send those comments out to the contributing authors. They had to revise their chapters, and then we resubmit. So then the reviewer B, who had liked the book, came back and said, yes, this is fine. I would go with this. Reviewer C, who hadn't really liked the book, responded and said they were still unhappy. We needed reviewer A, the one who had really praised the manuscript, because the press needs at least 2 very positive reviews to be able to go forward with the book. Unfortunately, reviewer A said they would need at least, I think it was 6 months. And we made a very difficult decision, but I think the only decision. We had to wait 6 months for reviewer A to give feedback, and it was very positive, and then the book was able to move ahead. But that was out of our control. The fact that you were relying on so many other people, the 17 authors, the 3 reviewers, you're counting on them to be timely, but you cannot control that. In terms of working with a co-editor, I'll make a comment that might seem very obvious, but I'm going to make it anyway, which is that you should only work with someone you know well, with whom you have worked before, and with whom you get along really well. Lisa and I had known each other for many years. We'd worked together on the Shirk project. We'd co-taught. We'd been urban studies colleagues for many years, and we'd established a very good working relationship and a friendship. Whereas I've heard from other people who've worked with co-editors that it's been like hell working with very difficult people. So Lisa and I, we had a kind of organic way of collaborating in terms of dividing up work. We often had writing sessions either at her dining room table or at a cafe, where one of us would say something and the other would respond. So I remember on several occasions, Lisa might say something, and then that would trigger me speaking a perfectly lucid, articulate paragraph that she would write down, and that would then advance the project. So again, it's very of Lisa, but the point really is be careful before going into a co-editor relationship with someone. Think carefully about how well you will be able to work with that person. So in conclusion, I would say I would certainly do an edited book again. I don't know with whom I might co-edit it, because the obvious person is no longer with us. And the thought of being the sole editor seems quite daunting, because like sharing the work 50-50 with Lisa, it was still, I found at times, an enormous amount of work. Were I to do this again on another project, I think I would be much tougher with the contributing authors. I would be clearer in my instructions, in my requests. I would nag them more, I think. Yeah. I might count on hiring a copy editor again. It depends who the contributing authors might be. So that would be an expense to bear in mind that one would have to, or I would have to take on. I would also consider, if I were to do another edited book, working with the press that looked at the design of the inside of the book as well as the outside. So I had said one of the attractions of University of Toronto Press was the books sell for a reasonable price. The cover I think is very attractive. The inside of the book is very standard. I might be interested in the idea of working on a book in which the book itself is a bit more artful on the interior, even though I know that would raise the price. It's just something I was recently thinking about. And I will stop here and look forward to any questions that might pop up later.
Thanks very much, Doug. And now we're going to hear from Rosa in Newfoundland. So.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. And I'm really delighted to be here virtually today and to have this opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. So as William mentioned, I'm based in Newfoundland. I'm at the School of Science and the Environment at Memorial University. I'm based in Corner Brook, so close to Gros Morne on the west coast of the island. I'm an assistant professor, so I'll be bringing an early career perspective to some of these discussions. And my background is in cultural geography with links to community planning. My research looks at how public space is designed and how public space planning interacts with cultural landscapes. I've edited co-edited three special issues or journal special issues, two of those as lead editor and one of them as a co-editor. And all of those have been done in the last 6 or 7 or so years. And that included working on special issues while I was a postdoctoral fellow at the City Institute, which was a really wonderful experience and a good way of learning how to do some of these things as well. And the other 2 have been as a faculty member at MUN. So maybe I'll just say a few things about the 3 special issues in general, and then I want to focus on one that, at least for me, was a bit more unique. It was an open access community-based special issue. So overall, the 3 special issues were each linked to either a conference or a workshop session. One was linked to the Canadian Association of Geographers conference that was held at York University back in 2017. That's the Canadian Journal of Urban Research special issue, and in that situation, we went into the conference session without having necessarily a plan to do a special issue, but the synergy between the papers was really interesting, and a special issue was a great opportunity to have some of those discussions more in depth and work closely with colleagues who are working on similar topics. The other 2 special issues that I've worked on came out of standalone workshops on the particular topics of that special issue. And in each of those cases, we knew that we wanted to do a special issue as that workshop was coming together. So there was contact with potential publishers before the workshop was actually held. So the special issue I want to talk about is for the Canadian Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship. They're called JASIS. They're based in the US. They're an open access community-based journal. And this particular special issue came out of a SSHRC-funded workshop, SSHRC Connection Grant funded workshop that we held in Newfoundland, which was on climate change in coastal communities and planning for climate change adaptation. This was not a topic that is necessarily within my field of research, but at Memorial University, and especially in the School of Science and the Environment, we're very much interdisciplinary. So this particular workshop included environmental science, environmental studies, environment and sustainability, along with geography and planning, coming together to work with community members, practitioners, folks who work for the province of Newfoundland and those who work for municipalities in Newfoundland. So that workshop was held over 2.5 days. It included community workshops, and it included faculty, researchers, and other practitioners traveling from different parts of Canada to the west coast of Newfoundland for that particular workshop. The sessions looked at climate change adaptation in Newfoundland in particular, but when thinking about the publications we wanted to have come out of that, we decided to actually focus on a slightly broader topic, because of course Newfoundland is a little bit of a specific geographic region and perhaps a little bit niche. So the special issue for the Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship was actually climate change knowledge translation. In other words, how does information move between different entities of research, provincial or other government sources, and community members? We decided to go with the Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship for several reasons. They're an open access journal, so there were no fees for authors or for us as editors to submit articles there. Also, the articles would be easily accessible to anybody who wished to look at them. This was also a unique journal because it invited contributions from community members. So it does have a peer review process. It has a separate peer review process for faculty or research contributions, and one that is designed for community members. And that synergy between community and university-based research was really important to our workshop. And so we wanted to bring that within the special issue process as well. The workshop itself involved academic, community, professional speakers. And so when we decided to do a special issue, the editorial collective for that also included editors from all of those backgrounds. So there were 4 or 5 faculty members, several practitioners who worked within planning or climate change departments in the provincial or federal government, and 1 community member as well who were involved in that, which is a slightly different texture to how special issues are done. So we had quite a few discussions about what it meant to do a special issue, what the responsibilities of each editor would be within that, and why we would choose to call ourselves an editorial collective rather than an editorial board or something else. Our aim in putting together the special issue was to capture the variety of perspectives, certainly academic perspectives, but also different community responses to some of these planning decisions that were happening. So we did put out a call for proposals for that special issue. We didn't limit proposals or contributions to the workshop participants, and that call for contributions went out to the Canadian Association of Geographers and all sorts of other listservs that were across North America and different parts of Europe. And we were really surprised with the uptake for that. So we had something like more than 30 proposed contributions, of which eventually 20 committed to going through with their contributions, of which maybe 7 to 10 did actually eventually contribute to the journal. So it was fairly labor intensive to both put out the call for contributions and then to go through all the different materials that arrived and to make a decision about which of those proposals would end up in the special issue itself. We were really interested in synergies and thinking about how coastal processes and planning would come together, the role of university research in driving community-based decisions. And we also welcomed papers from students, from practitioners, and also from community members. And those papers were a little bit shorter and a bit denser as well. The Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship is a little bit different than other journals in the sense that because it is publicly focused, they allow you to keep copyright of your work. So they use a Creative Commons license, which is different than many other academic publications do. They were also very open to having a conversation about how the special issue would come together. Whether we wanted to design our own review process or use the journal's review process. And we elected to use the journal's review process because they had such clear guidelines and such clear processes for working with community members and practitioners along with university-based faculty. The journal is based in the US. So we did factor in several meetings to have conversations about what it meant to publish a largely Canadian content issue in that particular journal and how to perhaps explain that a little bit differently to a global audience. So our authors for the special issue did have very particular instructions in how to situate their topics, how to contextualize their ideas, and to always be conscious that their work would be read by a wider audience as well. As an early career scholar, the special issue was both a fairly considerable undertaking. It took about 2.5 years to get it together. It published this past January in 2021, but it was also a really interesting process. It was interesting to see how different timelines operated, and I very much am echoing some of Doug's points here, that many of the university-based researchers sometimes struggle to meet deadlines, which became much more evident as especially the pandemic set on. What was really interesting is that our community contributors were very quick to meet deadlines. They wrote very quickly and they expected the special issue to be published very quickly. So the tension within our editorial collective was really negotiating some of that and creating clear parameters of when publications would come together, but also making sure that we could work with community participants and community authors to explain the particulars of that process as well. We had 7 or 8 people in that editorial collective, and my role as the lead editor on that was really about dividing tasks and being very conscious and very cognizant of the different roles and capabilities that people brought. So practitioners were certainly not able to dedicate as much time to doing certain tasks as university-based researchers, for instance, as well. There were also challenges along the way, so not all papers got through the peer review process, and we made a very clear decision as an editorial collective to stick to the timelines and to the deadlines that we had. And when a paper was not able to go through that process, or when it would require very extensive editing, we recommended that those authors pursue that paper through the same journal, but outside of a special issue. And that was because we wanted to complete things on a 24-month timeline as well. So there were some papers which struggled through the process. That included papers by university-based researchers and faculty, but also by students and community members as well. We also really considered the value of community-based knowledge in this and how that would relate to different planning processes and urban development processes in different coastal areas. So the introduction for the special issue took quite a while to bring together. Initially, we had a very long document. We were then advised to cut that down quite a bit. So in the end, it ended up being a very short document as well. But that was a particular challenge of how you introduce a special issue which has such a diversity of voices and such a range of contributions. So as an early career scholar, I did find this particular special issue process really worthwhile. It was interesting to dig in deeper and understand how open access publications work, especially because the editors of JASIS, the journal, were very generous in the amount of time they dedicated to meeting with us and in explaining their internal processes of decision making. It was very helpful in building synergies across topics and building on those research networks more widely and thinking carefully about the different ways of publishing and the value of those publications at the university, but also beyond the university, especially in the context of a SSHRC Connection grant, which was very much about connecting with community. And also the value of having a large editorial collective. There were 7 or 8 of us at different points of the process from different backgrounds and different positions. And that was a great venue for experimentation and for thinking about what academic publications can do. There were, of course, many challenges. Editorial work is administrative heavy, or at least in this case it was. So I spent a lot of time sending emails, having spreadsheets that I was keeping track of. And that can be really challenging in the situation of an untenured faculty member, which would be me, where I have considerable teaching contributions or teaching responsibilities alongside other things as well. It also meant holding a slightly fuzzy position between the journal editors and our special issue authors, which meant nudging authors to finish their work while being very aware of life constraints and especially what has happened with the pandemic in the last year and a half, but also negotiating with the journal editors on timelines and content and being aware that each journal has their own set of goals that they're trying to achieve. It's not always a comfortable position, but it was one where having co-editors is really worthwhile. The co-editors that I work with, a portion of them were people that I knew really well and that we had already collaborated before. Some of them were ones that I didn't know very well. So one of the key things we did as we got the special issue started was spend some time determining what our roles could be, getting a clear sense of what sort of contribution each person could make, having that written down in an email so that we could all review it in the end, and making sure that we could build that trust and honesty to ensure that the process could move forward as well. And yeah, I think that's it. So the final thing perhaps I'll say is that because our process finished during the pandemic, that created particular challenges. And you can certainly see how that impacted certain members or certain authors of the special issue more so than others. Our special issue was pushed back by about 6 months to accommodate that, to ensure that everybody had time to complete that work. That included the journal itself, which had a considerable slowdown. They're based in Alabama in the States. They had a considerable slowdown in the end of 2020, early 2021 because of circumstances there. So it created some difficulties for them, but also some important conversations about how we commit to different types of writing and ensure that we make space for different kinds of outcomes and outputs. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Rosa. And now our final panelist will be Laam.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Laam, as Willie just said. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk about my experience of co-editing a book on the margins of urban South Korea called Location as Method and Praxis. This book was published by the University of Toronto Press at the end of 2019, 2 years ago. But the memory, actually a fond memory, is still alive with me. I hope my story can be a useful resource for you who plan to work on or who are currently working on a collaborative project. Our edited volume examines how multiple layers of geopolitical and geoeconomic powers in East Asia are embodied and struggled in different locations in South Korea. We examined these subjects by engaging with Asia as method, which is a decolonialist scholarship developed by East Asian intellectuals over the last century. So in the book, we interrogated various locations or co-locations in Korea as a method to understand and theorize the contemporary urban processes in a way that reflects upon and often unsettles the categories and theories from the West. This book is an outcome of a 4 years long collaboration among scholars who had studied different aspects of urban development in Korea and who have been trained in different disciplines such as geography, anthropology, architecture, and Korean studies. These scholars first met in 2015 in Chicago in an annual meeting for the Association for Asian Studies. We presented at a two-panel session on urban developmentalism in Korea. Each paper's theme was wide-ranging from anti-poverty activism, politics surrounding Chinatowns in Korea, rural areas of migrant wives, to factory town of female textile workers, and so on. We found each other's paper fascinating and that these papers offered rich accounts of urban development in Korea. Um, there was an excitement about the presented papers and a deep appreciation of the interdisciplinary composition of our panel. So there was unanimous support for the idea of continuing our intellectual conversation and also developing these papers into a collaborative outcome. We decided to pursue a special issue. By the way, at the time, we didn't really foresee that the key theme of our collection would be changed from one about urban developmentalism to Asia as method. Well, we didn't even anticipate that the actual publication would take as much as 4 years. Um, the majority of participants of this initiative were junior scholars who had justly got the tenure track job in universities or had just finished their doctoral degrees. So we envisioned the project as a collective participatory project, but the editorial responsibility was assigned to the two people who were in relatively senior positions and had some experiences of publishing books. So I was one of them. These two scholars, two editors, began exploring different academic journals in the fields of Asian studies, development studies, and urban studies that might be interested in having our collection as a special issue. However, our inquiries to these journals did not succeed. Journal editors seem to think that a special issue that focuses on only one country would not be appealing to the readers who have increasingly preferred a more competitive cross-national analysis. In the case of journals specific to Korean studies, some of us have already published articles there, so those journals were not preference for us. So we changed our goal to a peer-reviewed edited volume instead of a special issue of journals. So we got contract from the University of Toronto Press. In the meantime, we continued our conversations. During this 4-year period, we met as a group on 2 conference panels and 2 workshops, both in Korea and North America. In between these times, we also had 3 Skype conversations. We were not aware of Zoom at the time. So we met in Skype for discussions and feedbacks for individual writings. We also read things together that can provide us with some theoretical insights and also discuss them via Skype. I think it was through these in-person and virtual forums that we developed a sense of camaraderie. We were all Korean females and were acutely aware that Korean female scholars in Korean studies field, especially junior ones, have been quite marginalized and in a position vulnerable to sexism and racism in academia. And often they are the ones who are unjustly denied tenure too. So in hindsight, we feel that we participants of the book project practiced on ethics of care to one another. We became colleagues to turn to for advice and support. And it was also through these forums that we identified the structural problems of Korean studies, shared our frustrations with the dominant paradigms of urban studies in Korea. And then expressed a desire to pursue an alternative way of studying the urban in South Korea. So in the conference and workshops, and we applied for funds for workshops to WICA at York University and the Center for the Study of Korea at U of T to host these workshops. And we also got the funds. So in the workshop, we also invited as discussants scholars in geography, development studies, and urban studies, and received from them valuable comments on individual papers, as well as on the overall epistemological underpinning of our collective works. So what emerged from these multiple conversations and interactions was the realization of a need for a decolonialist understanding of the urban in Korea that also foregrounds the relational and transnational production of the urban. So the contributors scholars from Korea and mostly are now based in university in the West. And so decolonial knowledge production gradually became one of the central questions that drove our study of the urban. This was the point that we started to examine the idea of Asia as method, as a tool to rethink our research subject. And so we started to read and engage with the thinkers from this tradition. Especially we read intensively Guanxing Chen's book, Asia as Method. And Chen calls for the de-imperialization of our knowledge. He argues that we should stop using the West as our major reference point. We have to multiply our reference points for our research and activism. So, and he also suggested a decolonizing world historiography that starts from elsewhere than the West. So this argument by Chen was quite reassuring for us who study South Korea, as our researches are often looked upon as being parochial and thus have much less theoretical relevance. And then another scholar, Begyong became also very inspirational for our discussion. We read his writings, multiple writings of his too, and we started to take seriously his notion of co-location. Co-location refers to a place with double marginalities in East Asia. These marginalities are both ontological and epistemological. So co-locations and people living there suffer from marginalities because of the systemic injustice generated by geohistory of colonialism, imperialism, militarist dynamics specific to East Asia. But Begyong argues that their struggles and their voices have been rendered invisible in East Asia and beyond. So Begyong stresses the importance of bringing to the fore a space-based standpoint in East Asia, especially the standpoint of the margins, which will help us decenter the Eurocentric worldview and build a decolonizing translocal resistance network. So inspired by these insights, and we discussed those insights through our Skype meetings and workshops. In our book, each contributor examined the margins of urban development in Korea as a method to understand the relational dynamics of the local and translocal structure and agency, and as a method for decolonial thinking and communicative, transnational, translocal communicative praxis. Asia as method scholars were useful in many ways, but we also found they had some limitations, and we had in-depth discussions and tried to fill these lacunas by developing a revised version of Asia as method. So since the publication of the book, we have continued our discussion and moved on to a different project, which still centers on the idea of decolonizing Korean urban studies. Our journey to the final publication was full of uncertainties and challenges and often internal disagreements. But I think we learned a lot engaging with these challenges through collegial and collaborative teamwork. The process was an open-ended intellectual endeavor and full of experimentations with unfamiliar intellectual terrains like Asia's method. But the result was quite rewarding, and I would recommend to anyone who plan on special edition or an edited volume to have as many discussions as possible among the participants. The process rewarded us with a solid foundation through which we move on to a new project and also to build a community of care. So I will be happy to answer any questions that you have about this process in the spirit that we did with our edited volume, namely the spirit of collective knowledge making and sharing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laam, and thanks also to Rosa and Doug. Thanks to the three of you for your insights about these experiences. Just to kind of summarize a few things from what the three of you have said. I mean, we've learned a lot about the economics of publishing, also the politics of publishing, the sometimes the struggles that are experienced in terms of forging a new path within a field, having to convince perhaps not only the publisher that this is a worthy enterprise, but also having to convince some of your peers in the same disciplinary or subdisciplinary field about the worthwhile nature of this endeavor. When you're trying to offer something that's distinctive and cutting edge and a worthwhile intervention into any research field. We also learned about the practical issues around the relationships between editors and authors or contributors, if you want, and the various issues around editing their own work, editing a whole series of essays by different people from sometimes different disciplines, who don't always have English as their first language, and then having to work through these sorts of documents as with the I guess the forceful hand of an editor or a co-editor, and dealing with that. I mean, I have a few things to say about that in the next couple of minutes. And then thirdly, the raw issue of finances, and not just looking for funding for workshops to strengthen the clarity of the collection as it's coming together, but also funding things like indexers and copy editors. And my own experience working with, in my case, McGill Queen's University Press was the copy editor left something to be desired. So I also had to kind of go private on that one. And I learned a lot myself about copy editing in the process, and also to funding an indexer for my own experience, and then the wider issues of peer review and the fact that your publishers are convincing people like us. Will you find the time to read through this 300 or 400 page double-spaced manuscript and give us your comments in a month or 2 months, that type of thing, usually at inopportune times, but those of us who have a kind of a sense of, well, I can't resist, I must read this, and they're the ones who obviously say yes, and then it's obviously a question of how long it takes them to get their comments to the publisher. So there's a range of issues that I think you guys have raised, and also in Rosa's case, the issue of open access publishing. I mean, you've all really raised the issue of access in your own respective situations in terms of who gets to read this, what publisher should I go with, what sort of a journal should I go with. Where the word paywall has become pretty much standard in our vocabulary for the last couple of decades in terms of us asking questions such as, who are we really writing for? Whose minds are we trying to become inspired to rethink particular dimensions of urban issues, urban life, urban history, whatever it is. I had a couple of ideas, just in terms of maybe introducing a couple of supplementary issues while we're waiting for anybody else who wants to come in on this. And the first issue I had, the first topic I had was the writing of introductions, and sometimes the decision to write a conclusion or not to write a conclusion, or to put in some sort of an afterword, or to, how do you, it's one thing obviously to introduce what you're trying to do, and then to try and it's another thing to find the outdoor somehow. So just some thoughts on those issues about, particularly about the writing of introductions. Do you, for example, read other edited books in your field and think, well, how did they do that introduction? I quite liked how they did that introduction. Is there a standard kind of scene setting in the first half of the introduction, and then in the second half you say, okay, now A is going to say this, B is going to present research on this, C, the contributors, those sorts of things. Is there a kind of a standard formula for writing introductions? And then when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of working with other people's writing, and even your own writing, because we're all editors of our own work in different ways, and publishers give us style guides, and then there are the more famed style guides like William Strunk and E.B. White's The Elements of Style, right? That kind of standard, those standard style guides for writing, where they preach about the economy of language and the use of varied vocabulary and precise word choices and these sorts of things. So if whichever among you wants to seize upon some of those thoughts from me, is welcome to.
I'll go first. We wanted to do an introduction. We thought it was important to provide a theoretical framing to this very broad topic of socialist and post-socialist urbanisms, especially given that the cases were located in very different parts of the world, represented very different kinds of socialism. So we wanted to face directly questions like, what is a socialist city? What is socialist urbanism? And we kind of felt it was our responsibility as the editors to, tackle these difficult questions and say exactly what we thought. Our book is organized into 3 sections, each with a different theme. And the question then was, would we write an introduction to each section, or would we just describe the structure of the book in the main introduction? And we went with the latter approach. But I think either were possibilities. And then we felt compelled to do a conclusion. And I think the temptation might be to just kind of repeat the introduction, but in an abbreviated version, and we realized that was not fair. So we actually worked hard at, having set out an introduction, having provided 14 chapters that each looked at the overarching topics. What did that tell us? And what did we in fact conclude? Interestingly, we had wanted to include an afterword written by a scholar who had helped us a great deal when we were working on the Shirk research project. And we loved the afterword that this person had written, but the editor at U of T Press hated it, and the reviewers all just hated it. Like they thought it had no connection to the book, and their criticism of it was so powerful, we agreed to drop it. And we felt really badly, but they were insistent, the reviewers and the editors. In terms of style, University of Toronto Press has a style guide, which of course we sent to all of the authors. They more or less followed it, but in the end, we relied on the press's own copy editor who took on the manuscript once the press had made a final commitment to publish the book. Their editor went through the manuscript, and they were obviously very experienced with using the U of T style. So they were the ones who ensured that there was, that all the chapters conformed absolutely to the style guide.
Thanks, Doug. I can remind our panelists that they can talk to each other as well as being engaged in by the participants.
I will go next. So about the introduction, like pretty much what Doug said. What we did, what Doug and Lisa also did with their introduction. We try to introduce those theoretical frameworks that we engaged in different chapters, and most of all, we try to show what kind of intervention, intellectual intervention, we want to make in the field of urban studies in South Korea. And also, we thought a lot about the audience or the readers of the book, that what are the target readers of this book, to whom we speak about those concepts, and who will be interested in this story, whom we want to know about our story. So we thought a lot about this audience and try to speak to those readers who might be interested in our conversation. In terms of the conclusion, we didn't have the conclusion in the edited volume, but we had an afterword. And as a matter of fact, in the afterword, we sort of put a detailed account of our journey to get to the final publication. So basically what I presented today was basically already in the afterword. And we thought it was very important to reflect upon those moments that we struggled together. We had in-depth discussions together, all the external constraints, and also the support that we got from other people, the interaction with the discussants and other cohorts and colleagues. So we used that space of afterward to talk about our journey and the trajectory of our collaboration. In terms of the style, Doug also published in the University of Toronto Press. So I guess we went through the similar process. But in our case, because most of the empirical cases dealt with the Korean urban cases, so there were questions of romanization and transliteration, which was a big headache, to say the least. So Korea government has this standard that recommends to those people who write in English about Korean urbanization issues. So, but then the rules the Korean government created for this transliteration, romanization changes every other year. So it was very hard to catch up with this thing. So that was a long process. We didn't want to show any inconsistency in using the romanized name of Korean places or Korean authors. So yeah, like among you in the audience, if you are trying to publish about in English about these processes in non-English speaking country, you will have to also think about those transliteration issues.
Yeah, those are important points. Maybe I'll speak to the Canadian Journal of Urban Research cover that you have there in the background a little bit. So that introduction ended up being much briefer than we had intended, not by our choice, but because of the journal's choice. I think writing introductions for special issues that are journal-based are a little bit different because it's not guaranteed that your readership will necessarily look at the special issue introduction. They might be using Google Scholar or one of the other library search engines. They find the articles, but not the introduction. So we spent some time thinking about what we wanted to achieve in that introduction. And it ended up being very structured. So there was an opening statement which explained how the special issue would come together. There were 3 or 4 paragraphs explaining the role of public space beyond the city center and why that would be a valuable thing to consider, especially in the Canadian context. And then the final third of the introduction was outlining what each of the articles was about and explaining how they linked together, sort of a way of promoting that particular work and encouraging people to read the full special issue. The introduction was a really productive process for us as editors because it was an opportunity to sit down and think about what have we tried to achieve through the special session at the CAG, but also what are we trying to achieve through the special issue itself, so the CJUR special issue. And it's, yeah, stylistically, the journal had their own method and system. So we encouraged all authors to follow that. And we were very fortunate that most authors did. They were very careful in terms of how they did that. But especially for smaller journals that might have open access elements, it proved to be very important to ensure that you follow their system as much as possible because it is volunteer staff at the other end who are doing some of the formatting. For the Canadian Journal of Urban Research, they also required a French language abstract. And we had quite a bit of back and forth about who would be responsible for that. So I do speak French as well. I didn't volunteer to do this because I was a little bit hesitant to actually write these out in the particular style the journal expected. So we had some conversations about the cost of doing that, whether we would have to pay for that in addition to other things that we were asking to have done, and whether the editor of the journal would eventually be able to do that, which eventually he was able to do that as well. So that was an important consideration. And one element that I hadn't quite considered before getting started, because for other publications, they seem to do those abstract translations as part of the submission process as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, actually, yeah. One of the other things that I thought about, and you've also touched upon it in what you guys just said, was the issue of timelines and the sometimes checkered histories that edited collections can have from start to finish. And when it comes to senior PhD students, postdoctoral fellows, those who are in year 1 or year 2 of a tenure track position, what all these stages of somebody's academic career have is the need for evidence of publishing. Like the difference that a publication in a journal can make while you're still going for a SHIRC grant as a PhD student, for example. Any sort of journal publication, a couple of book reviews, but an actual article is pretty much like gold when it comes to if you're a doctoral student and you're applying for a major grant. Whereas when it comes to you applying for a postdoc fellowship or a tenure track position, it's pretty much an expectation that you're going to have, at least these days, that you're going to have at least one refereed journal article or some sort of publication momentum. Let's just call it momentum. And it's in when you're going to conferences as a doctoral student and you're networking, you're meeting more people, and you end up in these sorts of planned sessions, and then the question is raised, maybe a book can come out of this, and you're a 4th or 5th year PhD student, or you've managed to get into a postdoctoral fellowship, for example. The question is about how long, the practical question is, how long does it take before this comes out, right? That type of thing. And you could say you're in, and they could say, yeah, we'd love to have you. And then as you've explained, 1 or 2 peer reviewers might think that some of the essays are fine and some of them are not fine, or not appropriate or good enough for whatever reason. And you've ended up on the wrong side of the referee's decision, and you have to be cut, right? So when you're thinking about publication strategy as an early career researcher or a senior doctoral student, for example, you could say, okay, I'm going to go for on my own steam in a journal as a standalone article, or maybe I'll try and be part of this wider collection, feel that I'm belonging in this field of research now, and I'm getting a bit of recognition alongside all these other people, senior people in the field, other young but important figures in the field, and I'm part of that. Or the book collection potential there, right? So I mean, this is pretty much the same for, when I was, going for a tenure track position myself. Right? The pressure was there to have stuff. I can't imagine it's eased off in the 20 odd years since. So what are your ideas about these kinds of the sort of strategies, the thoughts that or the options that students, postdoctoral fellows should how they should perhaps weigh up these particular publication strategies?
Maybe I'll jump in first as the early career yet untenured person here. So I'll say several things about that. I've edited some collections, but I've also been part of edited books, and those have been very productive experiences. Those have come out of sessions, either workshops, individual workshops, or other kind of sessions that were held often through the City Institute and some of the projects held there. And in those sessions, I really trusted the editors to move the book along, and they often did. So as a postdoctoral fellow, a PhD student at one point, that trust is really important. So having that relationship with the editor and having an honest conversation about what you need as a very early career scholar is really important at moving that along. Speaking as a faculty member now, one of the reasons that I've pursued open access publications actually has to do with some of SHIRC's mandates. It's really important for many of those grants to demonstrate that you're able to mobilize your knowledge beyond the academy. And one of the more efficient ways of doing that is to publish with community members to publish in open access journals, etc. So the decision to publish with the community journals engagement and scholarship in the States was very much driven by that notion that if we did this, if we were able to bring together these people to do that special issue, not only would we have a wonderful conversation, but thinking very strategically forward, as an early career scholar, I would be able to demonstrate when the next grant application came up that yes, in fact, this academic knowledge is very clearly moving beyond the university, and I've had a key role in doing that. So for me, peer review publications are obviously very important because I'm still going through the tenure process, and I certainly target journals that have whatever rankings there happen to be and all those very standard academic metrics. But outside of that, at least the way that things are done at Memorial University, that community engagement aspect is really, really important, both for grants and for the internal tenure process. So the decision to go for open access journals as an editor has been based on that. I should say that in both those issues, the open access issues, I did not have an article, and that was just a time management decision. I couldn't imagine both writing an article and working through my own peer review while at the same time trying to manage and be the lead editor of this giant special issue with an editorial collection and more than a dozen articles. So that was very, yeah, it was just, I wonder if I would make a different decision had I been tenured about how I would go through that process. But that was just a very clear strategic decision on my part.
I certainly felt badly when some of the PhD students who had written chapters for us were asking when, I need to put in my CV when this book will be published. And there were times when I had to say, like, we're hopeful that, before the end of this calendar year, but there were parts of the process that were completely out of our control. But there were also senior scholars at European universities who needed to report every year that they had published X number of articles or book chapters. And likewise, I would say to them, I'm really hopeful that by the end of the calendar year, and then I wouldn't make, and I felt badly. But I think if I remembering back to being a PhD student, I think I would have leapt at the opportunity had I presented a paper and then the organizers of the session at a conference invited me to consider being part of a journal or a book. I think I would have leapt at that in the knowledge that, like, who knows where it's going to go. Just as if on your own you submitted an article to a journal for publication, you have no idea, like, will it be accepted or not. I guess the advantage of contributing to something edited is that you have the editors moving it forward, right? So it isn't you alone doing it. On the other hand, that means there are more layers and more moving parts that could slow down. So I think I would, my advice to a PhD student would be to do both, to accept invitations to contribute to edited collections and also submit your own work independently.
Yeah, so I will touch upon this issue in my presentation a little bit, so yeah, there were some junior members, and I think they were the majority among us who participated in the edited volume. So we were quite anxious about having the book. Initially, we planned the special edition of a journal, academic journal, because we were acutely aware that journal publication is more important for junior scholars than edited volume, even though the latter is a peer-reviewed one. So we really hoped that we could go with the special edition, but it didn't work out, and we had some discussions about whether journal editors are narrow-minded, rejecting this special issue, focusing on Korea, like, is it more Eurocentric thing? Well, we had a lot of discussions about that. But in any case, so eventually special edition didn't work, and then we moved on to this edited volume. And I feel like it could still have been much better with the special edition for the junior faculty members, but I'm not sure whether, Doug, it was the case with you too, with the University of Toronto Press, but they provide an advance contract before we submit the final manuscript. So it was quite useful for those junior scholars who are applying for a job, that in their CV, they can say that, well, this chapter that they were contributing to this edited volume got some like under contract, under an advanced contract. So I think that sort of helped those junior faculty members and junior scholars and relieved some of our anxiety. Yeah, and then yeah, okay. So I will stop here. Sorry, I forgot what I wanted to say.
Well, we've got a couple of questions in the chat here. So maybe what I'll do is I'll go through them from Jessica and Negin. First of all, Jessica wants to ask Doug, that Doug, you mentioned wanting to have more focus on internal design, and Jessica's curious to hear more about why, and does this create another form of accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, the interior of this book is very standard, right? It is, I mean, it's perfectly attractive, but it is very standard. And I've started to reflect on the idea of a book as, is there value in a book that is more artful? And I'm not sure what the answer is, but clearly it would increase the selling, the price that the book would sell for. So then students would access the book through a library. If they became aware of the book, they would access it through a library. But then thinking out loud, I also wonder how many students, if that was our concern, have paid $40 to buy our book. And maybe the answer is none. I don't know. But I've started to look a lot recently at architecture books, which tend to be a lot of them printed on higher quality paper stock with higher quality reproduction of photographs, more color. And I haven't made a decision like in terms of what I think of that, but I wonder what the value is of thinking of a book as a piece of art in addition to being something that has a substantive written content.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I'm gonna go through Negin. Negin has a couple of questions here, and this is for everybody. And she has, first of all, she's got a question about co-editing, and she has another question about contracts. So I'm going to read out both of her questions so you can answer at leisure in whatever area you think you want to respond. So first of all, Negin writes, if we do not have a co-editor with whom we are close and comfortable to work, how should we think about choosing one? And can we only hire a proofreader so we know the individual's voices are still there? Or should the edited book be written by one or two persons to have a homogeneous voice? That's her first series of concerns. And the second relates to contracts. And these are her questions. Number one, did you create a contract to be signed by contributors so they accept the responsibility of originality, copyright, and getting permission for the figures, charts, and tables, those sorts of things? And secondly, what is the royalty norm, the percentage range of the publisher's net receipts that is paid to the editor after each copy is sold? Number 3, and finally, what other important points in contracts should we pay attention to before we sign the contract? For example, regarding costs that would be applied to the editor's royalty account if the quality of the images are not good, or things like that. So those are Nagine's thoughts on contracts and the mechanics of co-editing, I guess. So however you want to engage with for questions.
In terms of contracts, as co-editors, Lisa Drummond and I signed a contract with the press, but contributing authors also each signed a contract with the press, which stipulates the number of free books they would receive, which I think was 1 each, and what their royalty would be. And there are 2 contracts, as Laam said. There's an advance contract, which means which the press signs with the editors, which means they want to publish the book, but it depends on getting at least 2 out of 3 solid peer reviews, which they can take to they have an editorial board that determines the intellectual merit of the book project. So you need good reviews to convince the board. And then there's also a kind of management board that looks at the finance. So the advance contract says we will publish the book if the reviews are good and if the numbers look like they would work. And then once you've gone through the review process, if they're good, you then sign like the actual final contract for the book to be published. In terms of royalties, I think it's completely standard and you should not expect to make any money. And if you do get a check once or twice a year with a few dollars in it, you should be delighted, I think. The only way a scholarly book will make money if it's adopted widely as a course text in huge lecture courses across Canada. But I think the standard hard copy print run for a scholarly book in Canada is 500 copies, right? Like it is tiny, and the publisher doesn't make any money out of it. So you, the author, don't hope for huge royalty checks. And in terms of image quality, I think, the press will stipulate the specifications for an image, and if the contributors don't meet it, I imagine the press would just refuse to use that image, right? So like you as an author, like you would be the one who would be losing out because you would not have the image that you wanted included in your chapter.
Thanks, Doug.
Maybe I'll say a few words for the first question about working with people you don't know in editorial groups. So I've done that twice, work with folks that I didn't necessarily know very well, but in each case it was based on a workshop or some sort of other session where we had come together as a group to write a grant and to design a workshop. So you get a pretty good sense of who people are and how they want to contribute. In working with individuals that I didn't know as well as perhaps Doug and Laam knew their collaborators, we did spend a lot of time speaking about how we could contribute and being very honest about the time commitment each person could make, what they felt were their strengths in the editorial process, and what their constraints were in terms of either work time during the week or during the full year. And that means working with practitioners as well as faculty. Has been some pretty dense conversations about that. It also is helpful to have more than one co-editors in those situations because then the work can be passed around a little bit more. So, there were quite a few of us working on some of these special issues, and that was very helpful because there were moments when I wasn't able to contribute as much as others and vice versa as well. But it's definitely a delicate process, and working with people that you know really well doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be more productive, finish things faster, or get things done in a different way either, I don't think.
Yeah, same here. I echo with what Rosa said about, working with the other editors. Like the relationship should be should be with trust, and the other person that I work with I have to have it should be the person whom I can have the collegial conversation with. And about the proofreader, yeah, we did have for our edited volume, we had a proofreader for obvious reasons, because most of the contributors' first language was not English. So we needed to have a person who can proofread each individual chapter, as well as the introduction. But we worked with this PhD student at York University who is very familiar with whose research is in Korean studies and in the political economy of development. So it was not just the proofreader just didn't do correcting the English grammar, but also it was a very productive relationship that we built with the proofreader, and we thanked him very much in our acknowledgement and throughout the text, because his contribution was really great, that he provided comments, he asked for clarification about certain terms. So overall, I think the working with the proofreader was great, and I think he was sensitive not to destroy the original writing, but try to ask the authors to have more clarity about certain things. So I think overall, we were very much satisfied working with him.
Thanks very much, everybody. We've actually just come a little bit past time, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. But thanks to you all for your hearty support of our edited collections workshop. Thanks to Rosa, Doug, and Laam for their contributions. And we look forward to seeing you soon at our future events in the month of June. So until then, take care, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.